Hello. America's constitutional framework is being eroded. Let's discuss. Welcome to the Forge and Anvil podcast, where we embrace uncomfortable conversations about culture and politics to sharpen ourselves for the race set before us. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. Joining us tonight to discuss is our guest, Charles Cook. Charles, say hello and go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Connor and Zach, for having me tonight. Glad I could join and talk about this subject. It's something that is near and dear to me. But I appreciate you having me on. I'm Charles Cook, and I do a little podcast myself. And if you want to check me out, you can find me on Facebook. Check out my Facebook page at Charles Cook, and you can find me on Rumble and YouTube at Charles Cook 52.
Awesome. And of course, back as always, as regular guest is Zach Aval.
Haha, folks! Zach Vall, singer-songwriter, guitar player extraordinaire, coming at you live and direct via the Intergoogles. Live streaming on Tuesday nights on YouTube. I got my new album, The Way We Were, streaming now. You can listen to it right now after this podcast, but right now after the podcast, go listen to that, or do both at the same time, see if I care.
Alrighty, awesome. And of course, if you would like to support the show, go ahead and go to forgeandanvil.locals.com. We thank you so much for your support. Alrighty, so this is from the Heritage Foundation. Federalism in crisis. Urgent action required to preserve self-government. This is an amazing article. There's a lot of great content here. I'll go ahead and include it in the description. But for sake of time, because they cover some pretty wide-reaching stuff, I'm going to go ahead and just read this summary that they have at the top of the article just to get the discussion going here. Federal encroachment on state and local affairs and the government's insistent regulatory overreach are perverting America's constitutional framework and its Republican ideals. Countless statutory and regulatory mandates are supplanting states' governance over matters properly under their purview, including education, law enforcement, public health, infrastructure, insurance, use, and even civil service. State and local governments have also become inordinately dependent upon federal funding, which undermines political accountability, policy innovation, and civic participation. The challenge before the nation is to divest power from the administrative state, restore the constitutional constraints on government that safeguard liberty, and make America exceptional once again. So that's a brief summary of the entire article. A whole lot that we can cover there, but Charles, we'll go to you for the first reaction.
Well, I looked at the article today, and there was a lot covered there. But yeah, it hits home a lot of issues going on with the state and local governments. From here in Tennessee, I believe at one point, and it's probably a little bit more than that now, given with all the COVID money that come in. But at least 40% of the state budget is being funded by the federal government, and we see how that's leading to the overreach of government, because once you're on that string, then they want to control you like a puppet.
Yeah, absolutely. Zach, we'll go to you for your reaction.
Yeah, I mean, that's always something that's been a concern just throughout history. I mean, going back to really just the Federalist Papers themselves. I think about in a draft for the Kentucky resolutions of 1798, Thomas Jefferson talks about or stresses the importance of nullification, right? So choosing not to enforce certain federal laws that a state might feel is overreaching and things like that. It's hard to do when most of your state or your funding for your state comes from the federal government. It's hard to say no to that government mule, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. And that additional funding that comes in from the federal government really seems to come with strings attached. So, Charles, my goal for tonight is really to talk through a lot of where you tend to have an expertise in, which is following state issues and local issues. So I'd love for you to maybe unpack maybe just a quick understanding of state rights for the audience, because I think that's something that a lot of people are unaware of from the get-go, and we'll go from there.
Okay, well, that's kind of where I'm uh, have issue with a lot of people is that we call them state rights, and
Hmm.
but unfortunately, that's not correct. It's actually state powers.
Hmm.
In the 10th Amendment, um, it mentions powers, but the word rights are not there. And so, if we look at how civil governments are made, it's from we the people, where we extend our powers to give powers to government to create civil governments, and the people closest to us should have the most power, and then they extend it out from the local to the state and then the federal government. Um, and a lot of people, when they study the Constitution, they see that there, but they miss studying the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson states that to secure our rights, governments get their powers, their just powers, from the people, from the governed. So that's how our local governments and state governments get their powers, to extend those powers to the feds. And so we hear a lot of state people and a lot of people in government saying, well, this we need to remind the federal government time after time that the states created the federal government. Well, that's true, and that is absolutely true. But we also need to remind them of who created the state governments and the local governments, and it all comes back down to what the Ninth Amendment says: is we the people have those rights, and then the 10th Amendment, we give those powers to them.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that unfortunately, even someone like me who tries his best to understand these things can easily fall for a lot of those errors of calling it state rights as opposed to state powers.
Right.
So what do you think has gone wrong in terms of the overall the general public's understanding of individual rights versus state powers versus the federal government's responsibilities? I'll turn this over to both of you. Zach, we'll go ahead and start with you. But where do you think some of that started to go wrong?
That's a tough question. I mean, because you can trace that really all the way back to Adam and Eve if you wanted to. But I mean, to give a more political answer to a political question, that would be when states, or rather the people in the states, forgot about nullification and forgot how to exercise that 10th Amendment there. I mean, there are times when it's politically expedient, let's say, for somebody, let's say, I mean, all of us here remember a few years ago the whole sanctuary cities controversy there, where namely places like California chose not to follow ICE regulations regarding illegal immigrants and things like that, or for more red states, for conservative states, virtually any federal legislation regarding gun laws. You'll see a lot of them step up for that. So those things get headlines, right? They get you attention, and especially if it's an election year or you're up for re-election, that's super beneficial. But standing on principle is something that you should do year round, whether you know for a fact that you're only going to be a one-term senator or something like that. Rather than it's done for expediency, for exposure and things like that, rather than any guiding principle.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you agree with that assessment, Charles?
Yeah, I do. And one of the things that where I believe we really went off track was about 1913, and with the 17th Amendment. That's where a lot of the state powers was lost. When we started properly electing, easy for me to say, uh, U.S. senators. And, you know, I guess if you guys have had any conversations with a lot of people don't know that the state legislatures
Mm.
used to elect the U.S. senators to represent the states. And the people, I never had no decision in that except for who they elected as the state legislatures. And then once that changed and the people started voting on them, then it became a big lobbyist thing, and it just went off the rail there. And that's where the states lost a lot of their powers, because if they didn't do the things, the senators, the state legislatures could recall them,
Yeah.
and the states lost their powers, a lot of their powers at the federal level when that happened.
Mm. Yeah. And could you build out for the audience kind of why? Because I know there's going to be a lot of people that want to, uh, that will probably listen to this podcast, and they might say, well, it sounds like we made the election of U.S. senators more democratic. So can you maybe talk through a little bit of why you think that that amendment has negative effects, as well as the idea of why sometimes having things be more democratic doesn't always equal better?
Sure. It's just like our founders set it up, is, you know, for the general population, that's the reason why the U.S. House is based, our representatives are based on the population of the United States. And that's why we have the amount of representatives in the House versus only two for each state. And it didn't matter how big the state was or how much population was there was only two senators. And it broke it down for two for each state. And so it made it fair. It didn't have it wasn't based on the population, as I said before. And so each state had the same amount of representation. It didn't matter if you were Texas or California versus Rhode Island or Delaware. A small state, you still had the same amount of representation in the Senate. So, the state legislature had their balance of power there, and they could control what was best for the states. The Senate was there to represent the states, not the people. The state issues was controlled through the Senate. And then once we started doing it through, elections, that's when the things went off the rail, and now we see where we're at now.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have varying opinions in terms of both of our guests and our regular co-hosts that come on the show with me. And so, if you're not already familiar, Zach actually considers himself to be. In fact, Zach, I'll maybe let you speak for yourself. If you want to just go
Mhm.
ahead and give a quick overview of your political beliefs, because I think I think it's interesting to find some of the similarities that we'll probably
Mhm.
see overlap here, because I think you would probably agree that more local is better.
Mhm.
But I'd be curious to explore some of our differences as well.
Sure, yeah. So just the polite word for me is libertarian, but the less polite word is anarchist. So really don't. It's not necessary. I don't really believe in a federal government or anything like that. But that would be more principle. So that's not something that we can get into with conversations like this. So one of the things that sets me apart from other libertarians is I know how to have practical conversations like we're having tonight. Um, yeah, I mean, so that being said, yeah, the smaller you can get it, the less, the easier it is to keep an eye on everybody. And um, Another thing that he mentioned that we talked about money and things like that. Another thing that kind of hosts people is the creation of the Federal Reserve, because then
Yeah.
you've centralized currency and put your power to transact as an individual in the hands of basically faceless bureaucrats. Like I don't know. I mean, we can go in the whole history of the Federal Reserve. It's literally like every extreme conspiracy theory you ever heard, except for it's actually true and documented.
Yeah, the creature from Jekyll Island.
Exactly. They literally made it was like 5 people as the
Yeah,
Rockefellers, the Morgans on Jekyll Island. Like, you can't
right.
make this up. I mean, you can, but it wouldn't be as interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the overlapping theme here is maybe just centralized power in general tends to always have negative effects, and from both of our perspectives, me being kind of more conservative leaning, Zach being more libertarian leaning, we probably all would tend to agree that the idea of centralized power is just a bad idea in general. But I'd love to discuss, Charles, what you think as someone who's been involved in local issues. What do you think are some practical steps that people can start to take to get a little bit more engaged with their own local politics, whether that be county or city or even just state? What's some practical ways where you can start to get engaged?
Well, generally, the first thing I would tell you is go to a city council meeting and or a county commission meeting and just sit and watch. Go to a few of them. Number one, when you first walk in and you sit down, yeah, especially around election time, they all get nervous. Like, oh my God, who is this person? Is he in my district? Is he planning on running? And they all get nervous. But you need to sit and get uh, go watch a few of these meetings and look at some of the agenda stuff that they have, and then just watch and look around your area and see if you have any local groups, whether it be a an activist group. My my town has a local activist group, and we have several throughout the state of Tennessee. And see if you can find some of those groups and just go to some of the meetings. If not, find a Republican meeting or a women's Republican group. There's even libertarian groups out there that you can go find and go sit in on those meetings and listen to what they have to say, and you will start learning very quick what's going on.
Hmm. Yeah. Have you found a lot of help with local media by chance? Because I know for me, when I first started to get a little bit more focused in on my local politics, that's an area that I really tend to see a hole. That's for sure. There seems to be a void where that maybe could be. I'm wondering if you have a different experience.
Um, Local media is just as it's not on the grand scale as the national media, but it's just as corrupt.
Hmm.
Um, it doesn't matter if it's print media or whatever. They're usually part of the driving force behind, like here where I live, uh, the local newspaper is run by the guy who oversees the industrial board.
Hmm.
So, he controls the media, and he controls what's put out there. And basically, the governing powers here know who he is, and they dance to what he says.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and um, I know that there's obviously a lot of things that can be said about the fact that local issues are not nearly as attractive as the national issues. It's really fun to be um, caught up in some of the national movements because they tend to focus on the big issues that everyone can familiarize themselves with pretty easily. Whereas some of the local issues tend to be a little bit more nitty gritty, insider baseball a little bit. So, what do you think is maybe a good rule of thumb? And we'll turn this over to both of you as well for um, balancing being aware of national issues while maybe being more aware or at least equally aware of the local issues.
Yeah, I mean, just glancing at national headlines, you don't really actually have to read those articles because at some point you're just reading the same thing over and over again. I think it's just for me what it was just how I framed things in my own mind. Um, in a weird way, even though a lot of the headlines are grabbing, they grab you and there's a lot of conversation on the internet around the big topics. Majority of them, like 90% of them, don't actually affect you and your city, and even your state. What does affect you is your, like he was talking about, is your city council is just keeping an eye on those folks, seeing what they're up to, and meeting them. And I mean, just he had talked about something interesting, which was just you physically being there at a city council meeting is sometimes enough to kind of at least start that shift in someone's mind of, oh, okay, like they're being they care, like I'm being watched. And so even just through that type of pressure, they might think twice before voting for a certain legislation. They may actually spend a little bit more time getting a feel for the community. You're most impacted by your town, your state, your city, those types of things. Like my city council here is kind of full of knuckleheads, and like it's the reason why I will be renting for a long time. And because they're not looking at legislation that will help make housing more affordable, like across the board, for people that they claim to want to help and represent.
Yeah. Well, if you look at, you can turn on the news and you get 24/7 of national and world news. If you turn on your local news, you get a snippet of what's going on at the state, and then a little bit of weather and sports, and maybe the shooting down on Main Street in Knoxville or something. And that's about all you get. So you really don't know what's going on. But if you want to look at the local impacts, let's kind of look at that. And I can give you a little bit of a rundown, just like what's going on here where I live. Uh, we have some powers to be that wanted a new community center. Okay. So they pushed for this for a long time. And so they decided to go spend about $36 million on a community center. And what does that do? That property tax increase was 25 cents per hundred of your land value. And they spend that as well. That's only about, for average mortgage of $150,000, that's, maybe 20, $25, you know, in a year's time.
Hmm.
What they failed to tell everyone is the small portion of property taxes is actually the landowner, the homeowner. They don't tell you that the people that owns the grocery stores pays a huge portion. The industry in the area gets raped with high taxes. And so those kind of issues usually ends up raising the property taxes. And when you have industry that's competing on a global market, those kind of cost increases will eventually end up causing them to leave. That's the effect that these things have, but everybody's focused on Washington, and they don't see what the local impact of a property tax alone just for community center could do. So that was our city government. Now our county government has turned around and spent $100 million for a jail and justice center.
Hmm.
So the county people's property taxes will eventually go up because they say, we're going to have school repairs and stuff. And if you live in the city, you're going to have a county property tax and a city property tax increase. Well, guess where all the industrial parks are? And most industry is inside the city limits. So they're going to get the double whammy. So not focusing on the local issue where you have the most control, where you can go to a city council meeting. You can't go to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. every time they have a meeting, but you can go to a city council meeting. You can go to a county commission meeting. You can actually go knock on their door because they live in your city and county, and talk to these people. That's where you have the most control, and that's usually where it has the most impact on your life,
Yeah.
other than the Federal Reserve and printing more money and doing a backdoor tax through inflation.
Yeah. Absolutely. We'll definitely have to have an episode focused on the Federal Reserve, because I know I know that's a topic that we can't tackle in our short time together tonight, but we'll definitely have to prioritize that at some point in the future here. But one of the key takeaways from the article, it said the goal of reform should be to ensure that every federal mandate and preemption is necessary, effective, and abides by constitutional limits on government power. So, Charles, when someone says, well, what's my mayor going to do against the federal government? Or what's my sheriff going to do against the federal government? What would be your response to that kind of person? And what do you think the proper role of local government should be in terms of pushing back against overreach?
Got a perfect example of that right here in my own little county. Uh, you know, anything that's unconstitutional uh, can be nullified. So I see Zach agrees with that. And so, perfect example here in Hamlin County when we was having the jail discussion. They was trying to push this jail through because we're going to have a federal judge come in and mandate us to build a new jail. In the same meeting that they were having this discussion, there was a group who brought in a resolution to be passed by the county commission that stated that Hamlin County would be a sanctuary county if the federal government tried to impose any kind of restrictions on the Second Amendment. Okay? So we had on one side of the meeting, we had county commissioners trying to use federal pressure to justify building $100 million jail. But on the other side of the meeting, we were all going to be big and bad because it's a political issue that we're going to thumb our noses at the federal government if they try to impose any kind of gun bans or gun restrictions and stuff. So they know they have the power. A lot of them do. But they want to use that excuse to incorporate what they want to do. These federal mandates and stuff, most of them agree with. It's where we have to step up and say, you're not going to do it, or we're going to replace you. But we have to get involved to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Zach, do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. No, yeah, I can't stress enough the importance of nullification, especially if you're going to come at it from a conservative angle, and even my friends on the left can benefit from educating themselves on nullification. There is a great book that a historian whose work I enjoy a lot, Tom Woods wrote back, I think in 2009 or 2010. On nullification specifically. It's 300 pages and it's accessible. You can get it on Amazon for just a few bucks. And that's a crash course in nullification. And it's written for the layman as well. It's not, a dense historian, type of thing. It's written for the layman and you can follow along with it pretty easily. So, I mean, nullification you Google it. Google that sucker. It's really at this stage where we're at, kind of your first line of defense against any type of nasty federal legislation, or even you can there's jury nullification as well. If you're summoned to jury duty and you want to get out of it, just mention that you support that, and I guarantee you won't get picked for the jury. But yeah, no, arming yourself and just training and shifting your focus away from the headlines of the day. I know that it's attractive, and getting involved in your community. That's one of the things that I think the Libertarian Party excels at, whereas the other two parties kind of struggle with that. And the reason being is because the Libertarian Party understands federalism and things like that. So it's a bottom up organization. So it's a lot of the Libertarian Party countrywide, its strength comes from the local parties and things like that. So I would strongly recommend you get involved with that with them. You'll make all sorts of interesting friends and learn a lot. And you'll also get to serve your community. We did that a lot back when I was actually living in Nashville, Tennessee, and was volunteering with the Libertarian Party of Nashville.
Yeah.
We did a lot of work there and did some activism as well, protested a gas tax again. I didn't live there very long, but I also really liked paying, less than $2 a gallon for gas, and having not most of that go to tax, unlike it is here in Washington, where most of what you're paying at the gas pump is tax.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I did kind of have an idea of a individual's attention span. So I'm just gonna say that, and you guys let me know. We'll start with you, Charles, and then Zach. Feel free to jump in, agree or disagree. So I had said an individual should spend roughly 70% of their time focusing on local issues, whether that be city or county. Another 20% of their time should be spent on statewide issues, and then the remaining 10% only should be focused in on the federal issues.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah,
Zach, how about you?
I don't see a whole lot. I don't know about the exact numbers. It's probably just going to depend on where you're at.
Yeah.
But yeah, most of your time should be, spent in your community. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Charles, what do you think is going to be the quickest way to decouple some of these state governments and local governments to a lot of that the federal greedy fingers that are deeply entrenched in some of these states that are really mandating a sort of top down level of authority from Washington, D.C., all the way down to local counties and cities?
Oh boy. Well, we have the ideals and we have the knowledge to do it. You just got to have the people that to get elected to do it, and that's the problem. Is Zach could probably tell you he's worked in activism. Uh, if he's worked around candidates, there's a lot of them that talk real good game until they get there, and then they kind of get sucked up into the vacuum of the politician, the politics of things, and then you usually lose them. So it takes principled people willing to do the right thing versus whether they're going to lose an election or not, and you know and push back on this stuff. And it's going to take education of people. Man, you can talk to people and they don't have a clue. Most people don't have a clue of you know the Constitution and the Declaration. Uh, Article 1, Section 8. It's laid out there, and that's what we need people to see. Article 1, Section 8. It's laid out there. Anything other than that, it goes back to the states or to the people. Pretty simple. But like I said, the 17th Amendment, everybody's wanting to do this the Convention of States, the Constitutional Convention, Article 5, and everything. I don't even think we have to go that far. I believe the best thing we can do is repeal the 17th Amendment. That's the best start.
Zach, do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good reminder. A good reminder is, I think people are so used to outsourcing things that sometimes they forget, or we forget, that self-governance really requires a lot of responsibility, and it requires a lot of work and vigilance. And I think kind of like the curse of prosperity is that it allows us to distract ourselves with other things. That's why focusing on larger national stories and things like that can really just distract from, the corruption and things like that in your own. Well, I mean, these people come from somewhere, right? A lot of the people that end up running for president were at one point senators, or got on the national stage for a senatorial campaign and things like that. These people don't just come out of nowhere. They start as somebody's neighbor, somebody's friend, and things like that. So having those conversations and also educating yourself. I know we talked a lot about nullification and things like that, but also just things like volunteerism and things like that. Just and we live in this information age where these things are readily accessible to us. All it takes is just a little bit of time, 5 minutes a day or so, going through the Constitution. What does it really mean to have the right to bear arms? What does it mean to have free speech and things like that? What does the 10th Amendment? What does that look like exactly? And then you'll be able to start putting these things into practice.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I'd kind of like to use education as a model. We didn't have the Federal Department of Education until 1980. So this thing's 42-year-old, and we see the results of it. So it should be scrapped. That department should be shut down, and it turned back to the states. And we see that. But here in Tennessee, we lost a lot of control as parents, and local communities lost control along about 1993. The whole time I was in school, we elected our local school superintendents or school director of schools. They were elected here in Tennessee up to about 1993. And then the Democrats that controlled the legislature then voted to allow the school boards to appoint those guys and hire them instead of the voters appointed, voting for them. Now they go out and try to look for Joe over here. He comes from Virginia because he's done such a great job there. And he's going to move here, and we're going to pay him so much more money than he made up there. And the whole time, the next 2 years that he's here, he's going to be applying for jobs over in Arkansas because he thinks he can make more money there. That's what's happened to our school systems. Well, that's just an example of how starting something with the federal government has, in 40 years, has totally eroded our education system.
Yeah.
Yeah, cost per student has gone up and GPAs have plummeted. Yeah. So you're literally throwing money in the trash can for it. There's nothing to show for it. And then also dropout rates and things like that as well.
Yeah. Well, we are running low on time here, but this is a great discussion. And ultimately, our main takeaway for the day is just localize.
And nullify everything.
Yes, and nullify everything. Awesome. Well, we really appreciate you joining us, Charles. Go ahead and let the audience know where they can find you and keep up with everything you're doing.
Okay. As I told you at the start, you can find me on my Facebook page is Charles Cook, and then you can find me on YouTube or Rumble at Charles Cook 52. Subscribe and click the bell, and you'll know when I upload a podcast. And that's where you can find me and keep up with me. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can email me at charlescookpodcast@gmail.com.
Awesome. Zach, how about you?
Oh, everybody, you can find me everywhere on the internet at Zach of All Music. I'm pretty active on Instagram, doing a lot of educational stuff on YouTube, a lot of it guitar focused. Also on YouTube, starting this Tuesday, the 25th of October, I will be doing live streams. I'm going to be alternating between acoustic sets and heinous guitar lick sets. So there will be destruction, mayhem, and sauce Tuesday nights here. You can also find my new album, The Way We Were. It's streaming everywhere. seeing a lot of success with that. So thank you to those of you who've listened if you have.
Awesome. Alrighty, everyone. Well, we have been Forge and Anvil podcast. As always, if you want to support the show, go ahead and go to forgeandanvil.locals.com. We appreciate your support. Thanks so much for watching.